came about serendipitously. I was thinking about what to work on next after I had published a couple of papers on race and organizational theory, and I was looking for a way to extend my theory beyond sociology. I had thought administrative burdens seemed like one place where unequal racial processes might occur in organizations, and that it would also help connect my theory to work on race in the state. I had just ordered Pam Hurd and Don Moynihan's book when Pam Hurd sent me an email and said they were also thinking about using my theory to think more explicitly about race and administrative burdens. And they asked if I was interested in collaborating, and I was. So we argue that administrative burdens act as the handmaidens of the racialized state, because states often discriminate by applying burdens. Racialized burdens are a type of administrative practice that normalize and reinforce patterns of racial inequality in public services, simultaneously reproducing disparate treatment and obscuring discrimination. Racialized burdens can be either intentional but plausibly deniable covert rules, or facially neutral rules that disproportionately harm marginalized racial groups. Administrative burdens can arise or be exacerbated in the context of policy design, as well as through individual discretion in the context of implementation. Prior work in public administration largely focuses on how the racial composition of bureaucracies influence outcomes for both bureaucrats, such as teachers and police officers, and for the populations they serve. Another stream of research focuses on street-level bureaucrats and the individual use of discretion in ways that advantage whites and penalize non-whites. The concept of racialized burdens permits these complements these works by refocusing on the meso level of organizational governments that links micro level policies and individual micro level behavioral factors like discretion. One of the points of administrative burdens is that they remove discretion from individual actors, sometimes including public officials, by imposing onerous rules and compliance procedures. Thus, racialized burdens can pull bureaucrats who are personally supportive of racial equality into the machinery of structural racism if they just faithfully apply bureaucratic rules. Research on administrative burdens also draws attention to how the public experiences their interactions with the state. Racialized organizations theory assumes the state relies on organizations to help with governance, and that those organizations are not race neutral. Instead, the state is imbued with racial meanings that are contested, consolidated, and enacted through collective actions. Racialized organizations theory examines habituated patterns of cultural norms and resource distribution that exist beyond the preference of individual organizational members. In doing so, racialized organizations treat administrative practices, including the application of policy requirements, organizational rules, and resource distribution as mechanisms that help to explain persistent patterns of racial inequality. Here, I want to pause and consider what we mean by race in the context of racialized burdens. Race is a socially constructed relational category that organizations use to as both a rationale and justification for differential treatment. Racialization is the relational practice of ascribing racial meanings to objects, people, and processes. Importantly, racialization is not a synonym for non-white. Thus, all white or white-dominated organizations are also racialized because white is also a race. Rather than simply a demographic characteristic or individual identity, race is a feature of organizational structures, as racial processes influence the likelihood of an organization being founded, an organization's daily operations, and the chances of long-term survival. Racialized organizations theory departs from a focus on individual racial identity or demographic composition because it argues that organizations themselves encode racial processes that influence expressions of individual racial identity. Organizations are racial structures that shape, channel, and in some cases limit how individual racial identity can be expressed. Seeing racialized relations as a feature of organizations is a key distinction with work that sees race as ported into organizations, or that sees minority racial identity or the demographic composition as the key drivers of racialized organizations. Racialized organizational theory consists of several main parts. The first part argues that organizations are racial structures that combine ideas about race with material and psychological resources. The second part of the theory is a set of tenets explaining how these structures operate in practice. Racialized organizations enhance or diminish the agency of racial groups. Racialized organizations legitimate the unequal distribution of resources. Whiteness is treated as an organizational credential, and formal rules and organizational practices are often decoupled in ways that harm racially marginalized groups. Racialized burdens are mechanisms of racialized organizations. They're one way ideas about race are connected to resource distribution. Racialized burdens can shape and channel agency because they increase the frictions that we experience when we interact with public services. These burdens include three subcategories: learning costs, like discovering program eligibility, what forms need to be filled out, or how to apply for and stay in public programs; compliance costs, including filling out forms, documenting one's identity and legal standing, waiting in line, or responding to bureaucratic directives; and psychological costs, including stress, frustrations, anxiety, loss of autonomy, or a sense of stigma. What basic theoretical claims become easier to discern and better grounded by synthesizing these two theories? First, racialized burdens combine access to resources and ideas about race in ways that typically disadvantage racially marginalized groups. For example, many of the administrative burdens prevalent in welfare programs, such as elaborate documentation requirements, are shaped by racist ideas like Reagan's welfare queen, which popularized the myth of rampant fraud in welfare programs by caricaturing a Black woman. These racialized burdens then add labor or the frustrations that come from dealing with paperwork, and they disproportionately steal time from racially marginalized groups. The daily interruptions and delays caused by racialized burdens make it harder for people of color to exercise personal agency and reflect the state's ability to impose differential restraints on people's use of time. Individual agency is undermined to the extent that burdens frustrate people's ability to pursue their basic rights. Second, administrative practices can help launder racially disproportionate burdens through facially neutral rules and claims that burdens are necessary for reasons unrelated to race. This may be true even if racism is central to public or policymakers' views about those justifications, such as supposedly preventing fraud and undeserved access to resources. Administrative burdens often hide behind the legitimacy of programs that they are attached to, and the public values those programs that they seek to advance. This helps policymakers and organizations appear neutral in principle while reinforcing inequality in practice. Third, racialized burdens may emerge as more explicit forms of racial bias in policies or organizational practices become illegal, politically untenable, or culturally acceptable. I would say this is what's happening right now in the US around voting rights restrictions. Our work is complementary to prior theories, outlining the relationship between policy and race and allowing us to connect those theories to public administration practice in a novel way. First, Sauce and colleagues elaborate the racial classification model, arguing that race becomes important in the policy process when policymakers use racial categories and associated stereotypes to create distinctions in policy outcomes. The racial classification model is a micro-level cognitive one, focused on the likelihood that policymakers will use racial cues. Racialized burdens are one way these micro-level cognitive foundations can be institutionalized in meso-level organizations that mediate between citizens and the state. Second, The mechanisms of racialized burdens meet the disproportionality and decentralization thresholds that Michener identifies as sufficient conditions for scholarly attention to race. Racialized burdens disproportionately target marginalized groups and are decentralized because implementation is often carried out through state or local functionaries. Even though some aspects of administrative burdens may emerge from discretionary action on the part of street-level bureaucrats, they're often incorporated into the legitimate rules of an organization or policy, thereby compelling participation. To remain employed, following the rules requires workers put aside their personal aversions to differential treatment. A personally anti-racist bureaucrat who is just following orders may further institutionalize racism despite their personal feelings. For instance, Celeste Watkin-Hayes argues that levels of individual discretion are channeled by organizations. Extra scrutiny from white bosses often means that intra-racial relations between the clients she studied and service providers might be more constrained, and class boundaries between provider and client might be greater for minority group members because they are aware they are being watched. Thus, allegedly neutral bureaucratic rules may be decoupled depending on the racial identity of the person enacting those rules. To be clear, this is not an attempt to absolve individuals of complicity in harmful practices. But the point of institutionalizing administrative burdens is to direct and minimize individual discretion. In this respect, racialized burdens become organizational tools. They combine the agency-shaping aspects of bureaucratic hierarchies and policy structures with cultural ideas about groups to influence resource distribution. Buried in arcane rules, racialized burdens can provide a colorblind gloss for policymakers that might be sanctioned for openly disenfranchising Black voters or denying welfare recipients their benefits. By complicating seemingly neutral policy preferences, politicians and administrators can effectively leverage a tool to maintain white domination. Now that I've outlined the basics of the theory, I'm going to talk a little bit about the applicability by thinking about immigration, voting rights, and the social safety net. Racialized burdens feature prominently in US immigration processes. Whiteness has literally been a credential, both defining who can be a legal citizen in immigration law and shaping the experience and consequences of burdens. Presidents have used executive branch authority to create burdens that exclude racially marginalized groups, in part by making the process so costly in time and money that many just give up. From 2016 to 2020, the Trump administration dramatically changed the nature of US immigration policy, reducing the ability and thereby agency of both legal and undocumented immigrants to enter the country. It did so without a single piece of legislation, operating entirely through executive branch power. While some changes effectively altered the eligibility of who could enter, others made the process of getting to and staying in America harder via burdens that disproportionately affected racially marginalized immigrants. While the Trump administration's actions were labeled at odds with the American ethos, of welcoming immigrants, many of the tools employed echoed previous eras of anti-immigrant sentiment. For example, the Trump administration expanded the naturalization test for citizens by adding more questions. The origins of this exam can be found in the 1906 and 1952 Immigration Acts, which added English language and civics requirements during prior periods of anti-immigrant xenophobia. The Trump administration also resurrected the public charge principle, which limits immigration opportunities for those who might become dependent upon state benefits. The result was to increase compliance costs by forcing individuals to document financial resources. For immigrants seeking to come to America, the State Department used the policy to increase the number of visa denials tenfold, with 94% of denials concentrated in 6 countries with majority non-white populations, including 44% of denials from Mexican applicants. In other areas, US immigration policy has moved from explicitly racial designations to colorblind policies that nonetheless target racially marginalized groups with burdens, effectively maintaining whiteness as a credential. Contemporary language surrounding illegal immigrants, characterized as, quote, cheaters who need to get in line and naturalize the right way, is used to legitimate how the immigration process via burdens shape the agency of racially marginalized groups. This language justifies the extension of exceptional burdens around the naturalization process, which requires navigating a Byzantine bureaucratic process. When the Trump administration restricted travel from Muslim-majority countries or limited student visas from African or Middle Eastern countries, the formal justification evoked outgroup threat, made on national security rather than racial grounds, but the effect was to exclude non-white groups. The Trump administration also differentially restricted people's agency by stealing time. For example, it reduced staffing and closed overseas consuls, as well as offices that provided help to refugee applicants, even as they demanded more documentation from applicants and required in-person interviews for some applicants seeking to enter the US. Such changes increased learning costs for those who asked to understand the new policies, compliance costs via delays and additional documentation, and psychological costs via stress and frustration. Applicants for refugee status presenting themselves at the border face similar burdens in more dire circumstances. While international law confers a right for a case hearing, the Trump administration adopted processes to effectively void such legal rights. This includes deliberately slowing the process of application, creating months-long backlogs. The Migrant Protection Program required asylum seekers to stay outside the US while they waited for a hearing, typically in Mexican border towns, often in highly dangerous conditions. New interview standards compelled asylum seekers to provide material documentation of the risks they face that in many cases are simply impractical or impossible to obtain. These grim policies have parallels in US history. In the run-up to and during World War II, nativist members of the State Department used similar tactics to block the migration of Jewish refugees. The purpose of these burdens has been to make the US immigration process so costly in time and resources that potential migrants lose agency and give up. Racialized burdens have long been used to disempower and limit what is perhaps the most important form of agency in a democracy, the right to vote. Following the 13th, 14th, and 15th constitutional amendments, the architects of Jim Crow were forced to create an illusion of legal race neutrality, even as they designated race-targeted burdens. Ostensibly race-neutral literacy tests and poll taxes disproportionately applied compliance costs to Black Americans, eroding their democratic agency. Recent work has unearthed the centrality of burdens to disenfranchisement efforts and their long-term consequences. The 1898 Louisiana Constitution was typical of its use of burdens via literacy tests, poll taxes, and property requirements, effectively eliminating Black voter participation. A form of race-neutral grandfather clause exempted anyone who had voting rights prior to Reconstruction and their sons and grandsons. This clause, of course, only benefited whites. The net effect was long-lasting. Black voter participation in Louisiana was above whites prior to the Constitution, and it didn't return to parity until more than 100 years later. The past decade has seen a resurgence of burdens in voting. Such burdens reflect a growing partisan belief that limiting the ballot helps the Republican Party and a judicial willingness to allow restrictions, most notably the Supreme Court overturning parts of the Voting Rights Act in 2012 that blocked election practices that would disproportionately hurt voters of color. Since the 2010 election that empowered Republicans, 15 states passed voter ID laws, 12 states have made it harder to register, including mandated requirements to purge voters from the rolls, and 10 made it more difficult to vote early or absentee. Both historically and today, whiteness serves as the credential easing access to the vote. Excuse me, my dogs might be loud, sorry. Whiteness in the Jim Crow era largely exempted voters from the burdens that disenfranchised Black Americans. The alleged impartiality of poll taxes was belied by their prohibitive expense for impoverished Black sharecroppers, or by the requirement forcing Black voters to go before notoriously brutal Southern sheriffs in order to register. In some cases, Black voters had to bring white witnesses to register, making whiteness a literal credential for voting. White and Black voters both took literacy tests, but Black voters' tests were held to higher levels of scrutiny or tossed out. Discretion and the decoupling of formal rules and organizational practices plays a critical role in how burdens are racialized. In the Jim Crow era, state legislatures gradually invested more discretion in local election officials as tools like poll taxes were declared illegal, under the assumption that those local officials would use their discretion in ways that aligned with the politicians' desire to help illiterate white citizens vote and block Black voters. They blocked them by humiliating them, working more slowly, demanding excessive documentation, or imposing more difficult tests. For example, a politician in Alabama called for literacy tests to include subjective elements, such as the ability to interpret the Constitution, to, quote, give certain discretion to the Board of Registrars and prevent them from registering those elements in our community which have not yet fitted themselves for self-government. While such overt discrimination is unlikely today, clerks enjoy significant power that can allow them to adjust voter participation consistent with their preferences. For example, one audit study found that local election officials were less likely to provide a response or quality information to Latino names relative to white ones when they called to ask for information about voting. Minority groups are consistently more likely to be asked for voter IDs. And the differences are more pronounced in states where poll workers have greater discretion. Today, registration and voting frequently requires state-issued IDs, which are less widely used by Black voters. Longer lines and wait times decrease turnout, and these burdens disproportionately fall on Black voters. One study found that voter IDs increased wait times in polling places used by Black and Latino voters, but also, strikingly, actually reduced wait times for voters in white-dominated polling places. Black and Latino voters reported waiting 45 and 46% more time, respectively, than white voters in 2018. Racialized burdens are legitimated through fraud claims, and such claims have consequences. Historically, Black people registering to vote face threats from white supremacist groups. Today, voters may still worry about being accosted by poll watchers. In 1981, the Republican Party was barred by, a consent decree from organizing poll watchers after they posted armed and uniformed private contractors in polling places in predominantly Black and Hispanic neighborhoods under the guise of fighting fraud. The consent decree was lifted in 2018, even as President Trump falsely insisted voter fraud is widespread and sought to recruit, quote, election security operation. Trump's baseless insistence of widespread voter fraud claims most frequently directed at jurisdictions with large proportions of Black voters has undermined faith in basic democratic processes among a large number of his supporters. In some cases, the line between historic strategies to legitimate disenfranchisement and current practices is unbroken. 11 states feature laws that prevent current and former felons from voting. About 6 million potential voters are disenfranchised as a result. Given how racism has shaped the criminal justice system, such laws both disproportionately target Black Americans and meaningfully shape the composition of the electorate. Florida's felon disenfranchisement law was the most egregious, blocking about 1/4 of all disenfranchised felons in America, and tracing its roots back to post-Reconstruction policies targeting newly enfranchised Blacks. Popular efforts to restore the franchise to former felons were blocked by new administrative burdens. In 2018, Floridians overwhelmingly voted to eliminate the felon voting ban. Immediately afterwards, Republican legislators required an estimated 800,000 felons to pay off court fines and fees before they could vote. These fees are a compliance cost that can amount to hundreds of thousands of dollars. The link between payment and voting evokes poll taxes of the past. Former felons also faced considerable learning costs. The fines and fees system can involve multiple jurisdictions, plus for-profit private debt collectors. Strikingly, according to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, the state has no obligation to tell people how much they owe or whether they've met these requirements. Potential voters also face the psychological costs of stress and uncertainty. If they do decide to vote based on a mistaken belief that they've paid their debt and satisfied the state requirements, it's a felony that could put them in prison. Such burdens were successful at maintaining the status quo. 2 years after the referendum striking down the law, just 8% of former felons had registered to vote for the 2020 election. The social welfare system in the United States has been embedded with racialized burdens throughout its history. Both the design and actual distribution of these benefits, which comprise about 40% of the federal budget, inhibit the agency of Black Americans, stealing their time while simultaneously legitimizing the racialized distribution of benefits by limiting access to benefits with justifications tied to fraud and deservingness. Black and Latino Americans are more than 3 times as likely to say they experience discrimination when applying for welfare services or public assistance because of their race. These burdens are enhanced in the context of high levels of bureaucratic discretion or the decoupling of formal rules from organizational practice, which allows for their racialized administration. In this segregated and decoupled system of benefits, whiteness again operates as a credential, more often shielding white Americans from the consequences of these burdens. Racialized burdens were present at the origin of the first major US welfare system, the pension system for Civil War veterans. Here, colorblind laws failed to account for Black veterans' differing historical relation to citizenship, with the result of both undermining their agency and legitimizing the unequal benefit distribution. The many limits on Black agency under slavery created a path dependency that carried over into bureaucratic procedures following abolition. Black veterans were less likely to be literate, less likely to have the financial resources necessary to engage with bureaucrats and navigate arbitrary bureaucratic hurdles. And because many dropped their enslaver's name following emancipation, newly freed slaves often lacked the paperwork necessary to satisfy documentation requirements. As a result, a much smaller fraction of Black veterans access these pensions relative to their white peers. Black veterans of World War II faced similar challenges. Racialized burdens also reduced their agency while legitimating a decentralized process of benefit distribution stacked against them. The GI Bill was a federal program and ostensibly colorblind in the promise of benefits. Southern senators, whose votes were necessary for the passage of the bill, feared that such benefits would undermine the Jim Crow racial order. And so the program was designed to filter federal resources through local Veterans Administration offices. Here, local public officials and private actors, such as loan officers and banks, devised burdens to exclude Black veterans. The result was to constrain Black Americans' access to a wealth-generating mechanism that proved central to the mid-20th century growth of the white middle class. Contemporary racialized administrative burdens and social welfare programs are rooted in the historical design of these programs, the design that provides a legitimate cover. Racially marginalized groups are more likely to be served in means-tested social welfare programs that impose higher levels of administrative burdens on beneficiaries, including temporary aid to needy families and SNAP. By contrast, white beneficiaries are disproportionately served in social insurance like Social Security and tax subsidy welfare programs. The shifting of administrative burdens from state organizations to beneficiaries for means-tested programs has significant consequences in terms of stealing time from racially marginalized groups and their access to benefits. Means-tested benefits like SNAP or Medicaid require lengthy eligibility forms, substantial documentation of employment and earnings, interviews, and recertification as frequently as every 6 to 12 months. By comparison, one need only fill out a short form to receive Social Security. The government and employers keep track of marital status and lifetime earnings to define eligibility and benefit size. The differences in the racial composition of these two categories of social welfare programs, and thus the racial distribution of administrative burdens, are large. Black people are twice as likely to rely on Medicaid coverage and 2/3 as likely to have employer-based health insurance. Black women, as compared to their fraction of the population, are more likely to draw on means-tested benefits such as SNAP and TANF, whereas white women benefit more from spousal and survival Social Security benefits. This is not to say, of course, that white beneficiaries are immune from administrative burdens. The collateral damage that these policies inflict on low-income whites legitimates claims of race neutrality and denial of intent, even as the policies disproportionately affect racially marginalized groups. Such an approach may reflect a divide and conquer political strategy, helping to undermine policies portrayed as benefiting, for example, Black Americans. Such legitimations also help to explain the paradox that while more whites receive welfare, the visual images that people see and associate with welfare are negatively framed images of people of color. Indeed, there's robust evidence that the attacks on federal welfare programs, some of which have been around since the 1930s, parallel with Black beneficiaries gaining access to these programs via the 1960 Civil Rights Movement and the 1964 and 65 Civil Rights Acts. Further, the number of Black beneficiaries on state caseloads correlates with more punitive welfare rules, such as harsher sanctioning, specifically losing benefits when beneficiaries make procedural mistakes, such as missing an appointment with a welfare officer. Bureaucratic discretion can further entrench racial inequalities, in part by enhancing whiteness as a credential. Discretion is applied unevenly to Black and white claimants in traditional welfare programs like TANF. Welfare caseworkers, for example, are more likely to penalize Black participants for failing to navigate burdens, while white beneficiaries are given the benefit of the doubt. So we've argued that understanding relationships between public organizations and race requires a historical perspective on the roots of racialized burdens. The offspring of burdens employed in the Civil War pension system, social welfare programs, voting procedures, and immigration in the late 19th and early 20th century can be found in contemporary policies and programs. The historical recurrence of racialized burdens and justifications that disempower racially marginalized groups is a compelling argument for their durability and intentionality. Attention to history reveals not just the durability and mutations of racialized burdens, but an understanding of why they emerge and adapt. Across our examples, racialized burdens can be most easily observed when forms of overt racism are no longer viable, deemed illegal or politically unacceptable, but racial intent remains. In immigration, xenophobic statements of political sponsors may occur alongside the imposition of burdens that claim race neutrality. In voting, Jim Crow burdens emerge after the Reconstruction Amendments and evolved as tools such as literacy tests are gradually deemed illegal. Relaxing legal constraints, such as Supreme Court decisions, removing the pre-clearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act, gave life to a new wave of burdens. The close connection between racially coded dog whistles around welfare with racially impactful burdens shows how burdens bridge illegal racial discrimination and legal racially disparate outcomes. I will leave it at that, and I'm ready for questions and comments.